November 2019. The air hung heavy as lead over the dirt road leading into Martin's Fork Lake, where the early Kentucky fog wrapped around the Appalachian ridges like an old mourning veil. The beam from Deputy Sheriff Owen Hayes' flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the cold limestone outcrops that the people of Harlan County had always steered clear of. Control, I need forensics and a full perimeter lockdown on the North Ravine at Martin's Fork Lake. His voice echoed off the damp rock walls, sounding as if it rose from the earth itself. What began as a routine terrain survey after a report of lost deer hunters had turned into something entirely different, something no one was prepared to face, something that might finally answer the question that had haunted Harlan County for 13 years. In the crevice lay bleached bones and the rotted remnants of a running shoe, and on a ledge just a few steps away, the investigators saw the thing that sent ice through their veins, a pale blue hair tie, the exact shade Emily Carver wore every morning before her run. Emily, the jogger who vanished in the fall of 2006, leaving no trace except her dog Buddy racing home, covered in mud and trembling as if he'd seen something no one wanted to believe was real. For more than a decade, Emily's disappearance had been a wordless void. A 19-year-old girl who left home on an ordinary morning, waved to a neighbor at the bend on Ridge Hollow, then dissolved like mist off a creek. A dinner table, forever missing one chair. A bedroom her mother never dared close the door to. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like the video. Your support helps bring stories buried by time back into the light, and make sure you never miss another cold case file in the future. Because what was found that morning wasn't just closure to a missing person case, it was the first domino in a chain of events that would rip open secrets buried deep in this small Kentucky community. When police finally identified a suspect and made the arrest at the end of 2019, it wasn't a stranger or some drifter from out of town. It was someone they had greeted for 13 years. Someone they trusted, someone who had stood beside them at the very community vigils held for Emily. The Carver case isn't just a mystery solved, it's proof of a victim's family who never gave up. Detectives who refused to let the file gather dust, and forensic technology that finally gave a voice back to a girl silenced since 2006. It's also the story of a community torn apart. When Emily vanished, suspicion spread through the valley like wildfire through dry leaves. Neighbors eyed one another. Friends stopped speaking. What Ridge Hollow had hidden for years wasn't a secret of the woods. It was the secret of a man living right in their midst. The most chilling part? The person responsible had been interviewed during the original investigation, then quietly slipped off the suspect list. For more than a decade he lived among them, smiling, waving, certain the truth would never surface. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. Tonight we're going back to that foggy morning in 2006, following years of dead-end investigation, and witnessing the stunning breakthrough that cracked one of Kentucky's coldest cases wide open. This is a story of loss, deception, perseverance, and justice delayed but never denied. October 2006. Harlan Valley lay under a thin blanket of fog hovering above the damp ground, soft enough to blur the sweeping lines of the mighty Appalachian Range in the distance. An eastern Kentucky morning carried its familiar calm. A dog barking from a farm, a few houses down, a truck engine turning over somewhere on the dirt road into town, and the faint trickle of the creek below the hollow breathing steadily for this small community. Emily Carver stepped off the wooden porch of her house, tugged her light jacket into place, and started her usual run along Ridge Hollow, the route she'd taken for years, like a daily ritual marking the start of each day. The red dirt road stretched ahead, flanked by tall oaks casting dappled shade, broken by gentle slopes and occasional openings that looked down into the dry creek bed. The air still carried the smell of last night's fallen leaves, mixed with wind whispering through the quiet forest. A neighbor feeding chickens beside a wooden fence looked up just as Emily jogged past. They exchanged a quick greeting, a fleeting smile. Nothing more than habit in a place where everyone knew everyone's face. No one knew it would be the last time anyone saw Emily alive. Buddy, her loyal dog who followed her every morning, was trotting steadily behind her, showing no sign anything was wrong. But minutes later, Buddy suddenly came racing back to the house alone, paws caked in mud, panting hard and circling the porch as if trying to tell them something no one could understand. At first, the Carvers thought maybe Emily had taken a different route or stopped at a friend's house. But as minutes turned into more minutes, unease grew heavier until questions became worry. Worry became panic, and they started calling neighbors, then more neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Emily pass by. No one had. No one saw Emily after that bend. The family spread out along Ridge Hollow Road, walked the forest edge, shouting her name. Only echoes answered from the oaks. No sign of her, no reply, no clue where she'd gone. The peaceful mountain morning quickly gave way to a vague dread spreading with every breath. Finally, when every avenue of searching on their own felt hopeless, when the worst feeling rose and swallowed the house, the Carvers picked up the phone and called the police. Emily Carver was gone. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled up the dirt road to the house tucked deep in the valley. When the officers stepped onto the porch, tension already filled the living room where the Carver family waited, half panicked, clinging to the thin hope it was all a mistake. On the table sat Emily's fitness bracelet and the phone she'd left behind for her run, making the house feel strangely empty. The first deputy on scene began the standard questions. Description: what she was wearing that morning, her usual running shoes, the way she tied her hair back. He wrote every detail in a small notebook, glancing out the window at Ridge Hollow still gray with early fog. The family explained Emily's routine. She ran that same road every day, out and back in the same amount of time. She never went far off the path, never disappeared without a word. The mother's face grew paler with every repetition, as if the very predictability made her daughter's absence even more impossible. Another officer asked to see Buddy on the porch, the mud still clinging to the dog's legs, and the dried dirt around his paws made the officer frown. But no one voiced the dark thought yet, because from the moment they walked in, everyone understood one wrong guess could drag this family into deeper horror. Back inside, the officer asked the family to pinpoint Emily's exact route, starting at the turn past the backyard, along the tree line, down the slope to the overlook above the dry creek. The father spread a small topo map on the wooden table and marked the spots Emily usually passed. The room went quiet when they realized the distance from the house to the last place she was seen wasn't far, but it was isolated enough for anything to happen without a soul knowing. They recounted their own frantic first search, running the road, calling her name in desperation, retracing Buddy's path, and every word only thickened the air with dread. A younger officer stood silently in the middle of the room, piecing the information together into a bigger picture, careful not to jump to conclusions too soon. Instead, the lead investigator made the call clear: Ridge Hollow would be the center of the entire search. By noon the same day, as the last of the fog lifted from Harlan Valley and early sunlight spilled over the oaks along the trail, Harlan County's first search teams had set up a temporary command post right at the turnoff onto the dirt road where Emily was last seen. A small truck served as the coordination hub, an orange tarp stretched overhead for shade, folding tables opened, topo maps spread across cold metal, and rolls of scene tape stacked nearby. The atmosphere was urgent and tense, carried in the hurried steps of officers and the constant crackle of radios. The K-9 teams arrived first, 2 tracking dogs trained for missing persons in mountain terrain. Their handlers clipped leashes and readied long leads to allow wider sweeps along the slopes. Soon, local auxiliary officers and volunteers from the town of Harlan started showing up, each carrying flashlights, walking sticks, or small first aid kits. What made that noon feel suffocating wasn't just the rush, it was the heavy silence of the surrounding mountains. No passing cars, no conversation, just nervous anticipation hanging from every branch and every footstep on the ground. When everyone was assembled, the deputy in charge immediately assigned tasks. First, divide Ridge Hollow into grid squares, the classic effective method for terrain full of trails and thick brush. On the map, pen lines slanted into neat boxes, breaking the area into manageable sections. Each team got a sector, an officer, an auxiliary member, sometimes a volunteer for extra eyes. The goal was to miss nothing. Creek banks, rock piles, tree hollows, leaf litter, every inch walked step by step. Another officer was tasked with canvassing the scattered homes along the valley. He walked the dirt road, knocked on doors, asked if anyone had heard anything unusual that morning, odd noises, a vehicle stopping too long, any sign of a stranger. Most residents were stunned to hear Emily was missing, and almost everyone said the morning had been quiet as always, except for a few fleeting sounds they couldn't pin down. One man said he heard a truck moving slowly near his place, but couldn't remember the exact time. Trucks weren't common that early. A woman near the creek thought she heard a strong gust through the treetops, or maybe something else, but she never saw anyone. Every vague scrap was written into the canvasser's thick notebook. Meanwhile, when the K9 teams were given the go-ahead, the air around the command post stilled for a few seconds before footsteps, leash snaps, and short handler commands rang out together in the morning woods. The two dogs, after being scented on Emily's clothing, took off down the dirt road. Their first strides kicked up thin dust in the sunlight, filtering through the canopy. Searchers followed at a distance so as not to disturb the scent trail. Radios crackled constantly with position updates, everyone moving in tense silence, as if any loud noise might cover a vital clue. At the big curve where the neighbor last saw Emily, one of the dogs suddenly veered onto a narrow side path into the woods. The handler immediately paid out more lead, letting the dog follow naturally. The team fanned out on both sides, eyes on the ground, leaves, any footprint or disturbance. But after another dozen yards, the dog slowed, stopped, looked around, and let out a heavy, frustrated huff. The handler re-scented him on Emily's shirt and urged him on. A few more steps, and he stopped again. The handler looked at the team leader, an unspoken message everyone dreaded. The trail was gone here. The second dog was brought in to confirm. It followed almost the exact same line, circled the same thick tangle of vines, then stood still, tail down. In K9 work, when two independent dogs lose the scent at the same spot, it usually means the subject left the natural path, either carried off or taken in a direction where wind and terrain scattered the scent completely. No one said it out loud, but the mood dropped hard. The team leader ordered the coordinates recorded, marked the big oak nearby with a strip of yellow tape, then split the group. One team pushed deeper into the thick woods where the dogs stopped, the other spread out along the dry creek bed below. Footsteps crunching on dry leaves sounded steady, but distant in the forest, almost unreal. The creek team used long sticks to probe bushes along the bank, checked crevices where water once ran, because in this season the creek was nearly dry, exposing pockets of earth that could hide something. An older volunteer, a lifelong hunter, familiar with the area, pointed out narrow game trails only animals or locals would know. They followed each one, sweeping bushes, mounds, even pausing when the wind shifted, hoping to hear anything out of place. But there was only the forest. The woods team, following the K9 dead end, moved slower. Thick canopy and tangled vines blocked the way. They pushed branches aside, crouched to check the ground for scuffs, prints, anything dropped. But the forest floor was covered in last fall's thick leaf litter. Clear tracks were nearly impossible. Once an officer thought he saw disturbed dirt, but closer inspection showed only small animal signs, and so it went. Both teams radioing back the same empty reports, nothing here, creek bed clear, no new sign. The phrases repeated until they became a heavy rhythm in the already strained air. Back at the command post, coordinators marked each cleared grid in bold on the map. The more boxes filled, the more hope seemed to erode. A young officer staring at the map gripped his radio tighter. He knew the first day always mattered most. If nothing turned up today, everything would get exponentially harder. As evening settled over Harlan Valley, slanting sunlight, glinting off the Appalachian ridges and the now cleared sections of forest, the search didn't stop. Another team was sent lower into the creek, hoping scent had drifted downhill. Another pushed higher onto drier, rockier ground that was harder to see because of loose stone. Every step was still scanned by eye and handheld flashlight, even while daylight remained. Yet despite dozens of people, despite widening the search farther and farther, there was still no evidence, no sign of Emily at all. The silence of Ridge Hollow was no longer the familiar calm of morning. It had become a silence that chilled the spine. An empty, terrifying void, as if the forest itself was hiding something no one could comprehend. As the afternoon light gradually softened, and the search team temporarily withdrew from the forest to regroup, another group of officers continued interviewing witnesses in the area, trying to gather any detail from that fateful morning that might help narrow down the time when Emily disappeared. The first person questioned was Mr. Jackson, the only neighbor who had seen Emily alive as she ran past his chicken coop that morning. He remembered the moment clearly. Emily was running at a steady pace, breathing easily, maintaining the familiar running form he had seen many times over the years. She smiled, raised her hand in greeting, and Buddy trotted along behind her, occasionally pulling ahead then turning back to look at his owner, as if it were a game between two who knew the route by heart. Mr. Jackson was clear that in that final image, nothing was out of the ordinary. Emily wasn't being followed. No vehicle was parked nearby, and there were no unusual sounds beyond the rhythm of Emily's and Buddy's footsteps. She looked completely normal, he said, glancing toward the curve now marked off with yellow tape. Just like every other morning. But it was precisely that normality that made his account heavier, because it not only confirmed Emily had vanished after that moment, but also left a vast void where any explanation seemed impossible to find. Not far from Jackson's house, only a few hundred meters from the main road, a woman named Martha lived in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the forest. She was the second person questioned, since she had called a neighbor asking about the search party after seeing police pass her house. Martha said that around the time she was making coffee, she couldn't recall the exact hour, only that the sky wasn't fully light yet. She heard a strange sound coming from the woods. She hesitated before describing it, because she wasn't sure what it was, a faint scream, the cry of a threatened animal, or simply a branch snapping but stretched out by the wind, so it sounded human. What stayed with her was the suddenness of the sound. It wasn't like the usual forest noises heard on quiet Harlan mornings. She stood motionless at the kitchen sink for a long time, listening for more, but nothing else came. When police asked why she hadn't mentioned it sooner, Martha just shook her head slightly and said strange sounds sometimes happened out here, and she didn't want to cause misunderstanding or frighten the Carver family further. But now, knowing Emily was missing, the gnawing feeling inside her made even the smallest details feel important and worth reporting, even if she wasn't sure what she heard was connected. The third witness lived a short distance from Ridge Hollow, near where the dirt road met a side trail leading down to the dry creek bed. His name was Bradley. He repaired tractors in town and had a habit of starting the day by checking his tools in the yard. He remembered that while inspecting his toolbox, he heard an engine sound coming from the running route. He looked up and saw an old gray pickup truck moving unusually slowly along Ridge Hollow. It wasn't because the truck was broken down or stuck, there was no one ahead of it, but because its speed didn't match the local habit of driving fast to get to morning work. The truck was going so slowly that Bradley could clearly see the bed was lightly dented, apparently an old mark. He couldn't make out the driver's face because the windshield reflected the light, but he remembered the engine, old, a little rough. The kind of sound you hear from vehicles that have been on the road too many years. He hadn't thought it important until police asked if he had seen any unfamiliar vehicles the morning Emily disappeared. As he recounted it, Bradley stared at the dirt road, arms folded as if blaming himself for not paying closer attention. 3 accounts, one final peaceful image, one puzzling sound from the forest, and one slowly moving truck, though disconnected, formed a timeline that police immediately recorded in their notebooks. No one knew whether they were directly linked to Emily's disappearance or merely scattered fragments of a morning no one had expected. But in a situation where every detail could be the key to the entire case, the atmosphere around the command post grew heavier. This sparse information somehow made Ridge Hollow's silence feel thicker, and the entire search team understood that things were beginning to shift from an ordinary missing person case into something far less predictable, even if no one dared say it out loud. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the towering oaks on Ridge Hollow, the search team decided to expand the sweep to the eastern edge of the forest, the area where the K-9 unit had previously lost the scent and where witness information led police to suspect something had happened off the usual running route. The ground in this fringe area was damper from the scattered rains of the past week, making the soil soft and more likely to hold traces. Search team members split into small groups, walking just a few meters apart but close enough to cover the field of view. They used probe sticks and flashlights to examine every tree trunk and the layer of decaying leaves still lingering from fall. In the first few minutes, no one found anything unusual. Then a young volunteer named Ryan, bending down to check a depression near a cluster of wild sumac, spotted something small and faintly bright among the withered leaves. He stopped, signaled the group leader, and the team immediately gathered around. Lying among the still damp layers of leaves was a simple black hair tie, the kind Emily always used to pull her hair into a ponytail when she ran. Though no one dared confirm it on the spot, a chill ran through the group, because that tiny object didn't belong in these woods, and couldn't have ended up here by accident. The team leader, wearing gloves, picked up the hair tie and held it in the slanting late afternoon sun. There wasn't much mud on it, indicating it hadn't been there long. A few strands of light brown hair were still caught in it, enough for everyone to understand this wasn't just a sign, it was the first real sign. As soon as the item was confirmed, they marked the area with yellow tape, cordoned off the surrounding space, and radioed the command post. Within minutes, police officers arrived, bringing cameras close to photograph every angle and every small detail related to where the hair tie was found. While that was happening, another team member scanning the nearby ground discovered the next suspicious sign. The soil was disturbed in a long trail leading deeper into the forest. It wasn't clear footprints, but drag marks, as if something or someone had been pulled, or as if someone had moved hurriedly between the trees. The dry leaves had been pushed aside in an unnatural pattern, and in a few spots the soft earth was slightly depressed, as though it had recently borne weight. The team leader knelt, lightly touched the soil, and confirmed the surface was still fresh, not fully dried. That meant these disturbances couldn't have been there long, and very likely appeared the same morning Emily vanished. No one said it aloud, but every exchanged glance made it clear this was no longer a simple missing person case. The first piece of evidence, combined with the drag marks, instantly changed the atmosphere. The earlier hope of finding Emily lost somewhere had shifted, and everyone now understood something serious had happened here. An officer quickly noted in his notebook the position of the disturbed soil relative to the main road and the earlier point where the K-9 lost the scent. When these points were connected on the map, a strange diagonal line appeared, leading from Ridge Hollow deep into the dense trees where no footpath existed. That reinforced the suspicion that Emily may have been taken in this direction against her will. The deputy commander immediately called for additional units to expand the search and ordered the scene preserved for the forensics team to document traces accurately. In that moment, though no one spoke it loudly, everyone understood the timeline of that morning had completely changed. The disappearance was no longer considered a possibility of getting lost or a sudden accident. The marks on the ground and Emily's hair tie, lying in this quiet forest, pointed to the intervention of another hand, a hand that did not belong to her. As they began setting more yellow tape boundaries, the radio crackled from the command post, announcing reinforcements to the area. Those sounds echoed through the trees, like a confirmation no one wanted to acknowledge, but had to accept from the moment Emily Carver's hair tie was found. The search had officially shifted into a far different, heavier, darker, and much more frightening direction. Once the first piece of evidence was discovered, and the disturbed soil confirmed Emily may have left the running trail involuntarily, the Harlan County Police immediately redirected the investigation toward elements that could involve human action. Among the morning witness statements, the detail about the old gray pickup truck moving unusually slowly on Ridge Hollow became the most critical point. In a small community where nearly everyone recognized everyone else's vehicle, a strange truck, or a familiar one appearing at an odd time, always carried potential significance. The investigation team decided to start there, track down every owner of a gray pickup within a 10-mile radius of where Emily vanished. The task was not simple, because in Harlan, pickups were practically the most common vehicle. Old, weathered trucks with dented or sun-faded beds traveled every mountain road. The initial list contained more than 30 names: miners, mechanics, delivery drivers, farm owners. The list was compiled from multiple sources: county vehicle registration records, garage repair logs, and accounts from local residents. When the list was written on the whiteboard at the command post, it looked so long that a young officer paused his marker for a few seconds, realizing the elimination process would take longer than they hoped. Still, investigators began with the most certain details. The witness described a dent in the bed, a rough-sounding engine, and very slow speed. Those characteristics didn't eliminate many people, but at least created an initial filter. Officers divided the list and went door to door, sometimes driving over rough dirt tracks to reach houses deep in the woods. They asked the familiar questions: "Can we see your truck? Where were you that morning? Did anyone see you at that time?" Most residents cooperated immediately. Some even pulled their trucks out of barns or muddy yards to prove they were uninvolved. Police checked every detail: engine sound, bed condition, paint color, recent or old dents, even comparing mud still on the tires to the soil at Ridge Hollow. One middle-aged man said his truck wouldn't start all morning because of a dead battery. He showed police the dusty vehicle, unchanged mileage, and neighbors confirmed he had been struggling with it all day. Another was using his truck to haul firewood from several miles away. When police arrived, the bed was still full of freshly cut logs, and he had a string of gas receipts from that exact morning. The elimination continued that way. One by one, people were cleared by solid alibis or consistency between their statements, vehicle condition, and neighbor confirmation. By late afternoon, the list had shrunk from 30+ to 7. But the narrower it became, the greater the pressure, because the remaining individuals were all longtime residents with no serious criminal records, and none considered strangers to the community. When the list was down to 4, investigators noticed one name stood out more than the others: Dale Rusk. Rusk lived only about a mile and a half from Ridge Hollow, in an old wooden house beside a side road leading out of the forest. His truck was an older gray pickup, exact color, exact style, and most notably, a deep dent on the left side of the bed that matched Bradley's description perfectly. Moreover, when officers asked neighbors near Rusk's place about his movements that morning, the answers were vague. One said he saw Rusk's truck leave around when it was still a little dark. Another said he hadn't seen Rusk in the yard as usual. No one could say for certain where he had been when Emily disappeared. Those details caused Rusk's name to be circled on the whiteboard. To be sure, investigators went to check the truck in his yard. Rusk leaned against the porch, visibly annoyed as the vehicle was inspected. His pickup did sound rougher than normal, and the bed had the exact deep dent the witness described. But what caught the officer's attention most was the red clay mud still caked on the wheels and undercarriage, the same type found at Ridge Hollow, different from the dry dirt around Rusk's yard. Although none of it was yet enough to charge anyone, with most other names eliminated, only Dale Rusk remained at the intersection of too many coincidences. Inside the command post, as the whiteboard list was crossed off, until just one name remained without a clear alibi. The atmosphere changed noticeably. It was no longer a random sweep. From that point on, Dale Rusk officially became the primary person of interest. Yet at that moment, no one knew his name would stay tied to Emily Carver's disappearance far longer than anyone imagined. Dale Rusk was brought into the Harlan County station late in the afternoon, as the sun slanted across the Cumberland Mountains, casting long streaks across the sheriff's department parking lot. He entered the interview room looking irritated, but trying to stay calm, sat down on the old metal chair, and folded his arms across his chest like he was building an invisible wall. The lead officer began with simple questions: what Rusk did the morning Emily went missing, where he went, who he saw. He narrowed his eyes, pretending to think, but his answers were so vague that everyone in the room immediately noticed the looseness in every detail. Rusk said he had been driving around town, then went by a buddy's place, but he couldn't remember exact times or the friend's name, just some Mike over in Clover Fork, for whom he had no phone number or specific address. When asked to describe the exact route he took, Rusk shifted in his seat, scratched his neck, and said just driving wherever, making his statement even more suspicious. The officers persisted, mentioning the gray pickup a witness saw driving unusually slowly on Ridge Hollow the same morning. Emily vanished and asked if he had been there. Rusk immediately denied it, saying he never drove up Ridge Hollow that morning. But the contradiction appeared instantly when another officer pointed out that a neighbor not far from Rusk had seen his truck leave just after dawn, matching the time the suspicious truck was spotted. Rusk scowled, asked who said that, then denied it, claiming someone must have been mistaken, that he only took the truck out for a few minutes to check a noise in the engine and came right back. His rush to offer a new explanation only thickened the suspicion. Another officer gently shifted to the truck bed, the deep dent that perfectly matched the witness description, the rough engine, the faded paint, everything lining up. Rusk leaned forward, hands on the table, and said, "It's an old truck, everybody's got dents," insisting any pickup looked the same. He tried to sound confident, but his breathing grew faster. His eyes darted, avoiding direct contact. The questions continued about the red clay mud under the truck, distinctive of Ridge Hollow. Rusk paused a beat, then said he had driven through a relative's land north of town, but when asked the relative's name, he said, "Can't really remember, haven't been there in a while," adding another tangle to his story. When asked to sign the statement, he hesitated several seconds before picking up the pen, as if afraid of digging himself deeper. Yet despite the many contradictions and evasions, police still had no concrete evidence to charge him. No witness saw him approach Emily, no surveillance cameras, nothing of Emily's found in his truck or yard, and the mud, while matching the color of Ridge Hollow soil, wasn't legally conclusive. One additional difficulty in holding him: Rusk steadfastly maintained he had no involvement and no reason to harm a girl he barely knew. When asked if he had ever spoken to or even seen Emily on her runs, he immediately said no, don't know anyone from that house, even though neighbors said he had often seen her run past the road in front of his place. Police could tell he was carefully hiding something, but they couldn't prove it. One officer tried mental pressure, saying everyone knows you were on that road, but Rusk just shrugged and replied defiantly, "Let them think what they want. I didn't do anything wrong." After nearly 2 hours of questioning, the only thing the team could be certain of was that Dale Rusk was not telling the truth. But in an investigation, a liar alone isn't enough to hold someone. No physical trace tied him, no signs of violence on his clothing, no evidence in the truck. Police had no choice but to release him, even though every person in the room felt the sharp frustration of watching the most suspicious man walk out of the station as if he had nothing to do with it. When the interview room door closed behind him, heavy silence lasted several seconds. They knew he was hiding something. They knew he was present at a time he shouldn't have been, but they had nothing to keep him. And so Dale Rusk left the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, still a free man, while Emily Carver remained lost somewhere in the misty valleys of Kentucky. In the days following the interrogation of Dale Rusk, The investigation entered its most difficult phase, an almost absolute dead zone where no clue was strong enough to pull the team out of the endless loop of stagnation. Harlan County in 2006 had no traffic cameras, no security cameras at the small stores, and the scattered residents along the Appalachian Valley didn't have surveillance systems on their porches either. Everything relied on human memory, and memory always faded a little more with each passing day. The mud that matched the soil color in Ridge Hollow wasn't evidence. Emily's hair tie was the only physical item recovered, but it led nowhere new. Every attempt to collect DNA from the disturbed earth failed because the samples were too small, too contaminated, or had been ruined by rainwater. No one could determine whether those marks came from a struggle or were just natural disturbance in the woods. The canine units kept searching for nearly a full week, working their way through every ravine, creek bank, and rocky slope, but they never picked up any scent trail strong enough to follow. The Ridge Hollow Trail gradually became an obsession. Every new search ended exactly where the last one began, with zero forward progress. One veteran officer even said he'd never seen a missing person case this slippery, as if the girl had simply been blown off the face of the earth without leaving a final breath behind. In the early days, dozens of volunteers poured into the valley, carrying flashlights, probing sticks, and maps, hoping to find Emily somewhere injured, lost, or unconscious. But the longer they searched, the more terrifying the forest silence became. There were no torn clothes, no running shoes, no obvious drag marks, no screams anyone had heard. The search teams expanded the grid to rarely used back roads, mountainside rock fields, and the area's locals called pocket hollows, narrow, deep terrain pockets. But they found nothing except their own footprints. Some residents organized their own nighttime searches, convinced something had been missed in daylight, but the darkness only made Ridge Hollow feel colder and more lifeless, signaling nothing except endless emptiness. Police re-examined every witness statement. The person who heard strange noises in the woods wasn't sure whether it was human or just deer. The person who saw a gray pickup driving slowly couldn't make out the plate. The neighbor who saw Emily last couldn't remember the exact minute. Everything was half there, nothing solid enough to become evidence. Meanwhile, Dale Rusk, the only person who couldn't provide a reasonable alibi, continued living peacefully in his log house, working odd jobs, avoiding neighbors, and keeping his distance from any further interview attempts. Police couldn't do anything except watch him from afar, but it was all pointless. No suspicious behavior, no sign he was hiding anything right now. And then, after 2 weeks with no new leads at all, the volunteer numbers started dropping. Residents went back to their daily lives. The local papers moved on to other stories, and the command post set up at the entrance to Ridge Hollow was taken down, returning the road to its original quiet. The case file stayed open, but no one knew what to do next. Unanswered questions began to hang over the community. Had Emily been abducted? Was she still alive? Was the perpetrator someone they greeted every day? But without evidence, without direction, without a break, the only thing the investigators could do was wait. A cruel kind of waiting that turned every passing day into a burden. By the end of summer 2006, the Emily Carver disappearance had essentially frozen completely. The file was reorganized, moved to periodic review status, and the phrase "no further leads" appeared over and over in every subsequent report. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew the case was going cold. In that silence, in a forgotten corner of Harlan County, Emily Carver's story began drifting into the hazy realm of local memory, not because people forgot her, but because no one knew where to look for her anymore. Fall 2006 came and went without bringing any new light to Emily Carver's disappearance. And when the first snow dusted the Appalachian ridges, news about her gradually thinned out in the local papers, reduced to small blurbs buried among stories about the economy and weather. At first, the community still held prayer vigils and symbolic runs to keep Emily in our hearts, but over time, attendance dwindled, not because they forgot Emily, but because life forced them back to daily responsibilities. The Carver family was different. They kept searching in the only way people who have lost a loved one truly understand. Quietly, relentlessly, desperately, yet unable to let go. Emily's mother still called her daughter's name every morning when she drove past Ridge Hollow. Her father saved every old flyer, every search map, every clue, no matter how meaningless. They stopped by the sheriff's office once a month to ask if anything was new, and the answer was always the same. No, still nothing. The officers who worked the original investigation still remembered the case clearly, but they also admitted that, without new physical evidence, new statements, or technology advanced enough to do anything with the poor DNA samples from the old scene, the case was essentially frozen. Every year, the Harlan County Sheriff's Office went through the required review of unsolved cases, and Emily's file was always listed as open but data deficient. Some younger deputies, who hadn't been part of the original search, read the file anyway, trying to picture what happened, but they all reached the same conclusion: not enough information to pursue any specific direction. Outside, the Kentucky mountains changed with the seasons, but Ridge Hollow stayed the same, silent, deep, as if it had swallowed every memory of the morning Emily vanished. The flyers taped to telephone poles faded and tore in the rain and wind, until only pale scraps remained that no one bothered to replace. Emily's friends graduated high school, went to college, moved away, and when they came home to visit, they still avoided looking too long at Ridge Hollow because the place always brought back a hollow ache that time couldn't erase. A few locals swore they saw a girl who looked like Emily in Lexington or Knoxville, but when police checked, they were always someone else. Every tiny hope ending in bigger disappointment. The Carvers kept Emily's room exactly as it was: the snow globe nightlight, the small bookshelf, the second pair of running shoes she hadn't worn that morning. Those objects weren't just things, they were daily reminders that Emily's story had never reached an ending. 12 years passed since the day Emily disappeared, and in that time, Harlan County changed. A few new stores opened, some roads were repaved, people moved in and moved out. But Emily Carver's disappearance remained in the collective memory like a cut that never heals. In 2018, during the Harlan County Sheriff's Office year-end review, Emily's file was pulled one more time. This time, it was no longer classified as active. It was moved to cold case status, cases with no remaining leads, no investigative direction, and no longer a department priority. The decision wasn't announced loudly, but the Carver family received official notification. Emily's file would be preserved and reviewed periodically. But there would no longer be a dedicated investigator. When Mrs. Carver heard the news, she just nodded quietly. She had waited for a miracle so long without ever seeing its light. Her husband took it much harder. He kept asking whether there was anything left to do, any area they hadn't searched, but the answer never changed. Moving the case to cold case status wasn't the end, but it was an admission that everything possible in the initial phase had already been done, and the world had not preserved a single trace of Emily to hold on to. After 12 years of nothing changing, the Harlan community stopped talking about the disappearance much, though deep down they still felt uneasy whenever they thought about that morning. Because if a girl like Emily could vanish without a trace, it meant anyone could disappear the same way. And among the wind in the pines and the murmur of shallow streams at the bottom of the valley, the name Emily Carver continued to smolder, like a question that was never answered. The case had officially become a cold case, and all that remained was time and the fragile hope that one day the silence would break on its own and reveal a clue no one had found in the past 12 years. In the spring of 2019, while damp air still clung to the Kentucky hillsides, the Harlan County Sheriff's Office conducted its annual cold case review. And during that review, the Emily Carver missing person file landed on the desk of Detective Nathan Renfield, an investigator newly transferred from Lexington after more than 10 years working backlog and long-term missing persons cases. Renfield opened the yellowed folder with frayed edges, full of old notes, crime scene diagrams, witness statements, and reports that had gone nowhere since 2006. When he turned to the first page listing the date Emily vanished, he could feel the silence that had lasted more than a decade. A case buried in time not because it was forgotten, but because no one had found anything to grab onto to move it forward. Sitting in his small office overlooking the Appalachian ridges, Renfield read the entire file from beginning to end, as if he knew nothing about the case. He jotted down every inconsistency, every suspicious detail, every gap that hadn't been dug into. More than an hour later, the whiteboard behind him was covered. Questions, question marks, arrows connecting scattered points. The first thing Renfield noticed was the fundamental weakness of the 2006 investigation: lack of physical evidence and lack of technology. No DNA, no cameras, no traces. Police back then had only witness statements and a quiet forest road. Renfield paused when he reread the section about evidence collection at the scene. 2006 technology couldn't do much with such small, contaminated samples. But 2019 was different. Modern labs could analyze microscopic DNA amounts and separate complex mixtures that used to be considered useless. He closed the file and wrote immediately, "Retest 2006 scene samples, possible with current technology." But that wasn't the only weakness. Renfield paid special attention to the gray pickup witnesses saw on Ridge Hollow the exact morning Emily disappeared, and the fact that Dale Rusk was the only person on the list without a clear alibi. Reading Rusk's interrogation transcript again, Renfield felt something was off from the very first answer Rusk gave. Not that he was lying, more the way he lied: vague, constantly shifting, evasive, but not overly nervous, like someone who had time to prepare a sloppy script and still felt confident police couldn't touch him if he left no traces. Renfield circled in red every contradiction in Rusk's statement: the time he claimed to have left home, the route, his denial of driving through Ridge Hollow despite a witness placing his truck there, and especially the visiting a friend story where he couldn't remember the name, phone number, or address. To Renfield, those contradictions weren't the marks of an innocent person being pressed. They were the kind of deflections used by someone who believed all traces had vanished with time. He looked at the old Ridge Hollow map, still hanging in the records room: red dirt road, creekside, dense oak forest. Why had the 2006 searches found nothing but one hair tie? Why were there no clearer signs of a struggle? Why nothing else belonging to Emily? Renfield underlined the biggest question: where is the body? A disappearance so complete that the body is never found always leaves a strange void, and that void was where Renfield wanted to start over. He reread the 2006 witness list: people who saw Emily jogging past, who heard odd noises in the woods, who saw the gray truck moving slowly. Renfield marked them all, noting beside several names that they had moved away, while others still lived locally. He decided re-interview every witness, this time with a 2019 perspective. When he reached the internal notes section, he found a short entry: insufficient evidence for long-term surveillance of Dale Rusk. Old handwriting, concise, reflecting surrender after months of no progress. Renfield exhaled slowly and wrote on the board, "Re-evaluate Dale Rusk from scratch. 2019. What struck him most wasn't just that Rusk looked suspicious, it was that Rusk had essentially slipped out of the suspect pool simply because police couldn't prove anything in 2006. 13 years later, Rusk still lived in the same house, same beat-up truck in the yard, still the reclusive, unpredictable man the file described. People like that don't naturally become less suspicious over time. Renfield sat quietly for a few seconds staring at the now crowded whiteboard. This file had problems, not because the 2006 investigators did anything wrong, but because they were limited information, limited technology, limited time. But 2019 was different. Renfield had better technology, better profiling knowledge, and most importantly, he had no emotional tie to the old investigation. No baggage from the dead ends they hit. He walked out of his office, carrying the thick Emily Carver file, and told the lieutenant, "I want to start over. From step one. From day one." Not because he thought it would be easy to find answers, but because this case had been left in the dark too long. And sometimes, the only thing a cold case needs to wake up is someone willing to open a door that's been closed for over 10 years. Back in the Harlan County evidence room after more than a decade sealed, Detective Renfield stood in front of the small box containing everything that remained from Emily Carver's disappearance scene, and realized that among the very few items, the most important was the hair tie found at the edge of Ridge Hollow Forest in 2006. He logged a request to send the hair tie to the state lab with priority instructions to analyze DNA using the latest methods. When the preliminary results came back a few weeks later, Renfield focused entirely on the report. The hair tie carried very faint touch DNA, not enough for a full profile, but enough to detect two sources, one belonging to Emily and a second unidentified male source. This report wasn't an answer, but it was the first puzzle piece the case had never had before. In the 2006 file, there was no mention whatsoever of any male DNA on Emily's only piece of evidence from the scene. The sample was too small for a 20 locus coetus profile, but Renfield knew that even a few sex markers and rare characteristics could dramatically narrow the suspect pool. He requested further YSTR analysis, technology that traces DNA along the male line, making it possible to establish family relationships or completely rule out individuals with different Y haplotypes. At the same time, he sent the hair tie for soil microtrace analysis, something 2006 had considered meaningless. Back then, no one thought dirt could tell a story. But in 2019, it could. Mineral, pollen, and particle analysis could pinpoint origin within a few hundred yards. When the soil report came back, Renfield read each line almost holding his breath. The dirt on the hair tie contained a mixture of feldspar, fragmented mica, and a small amount of calcium carbonate, a rare combination in the main Ridge Hollow area, but common in the terrain pockets along the northern slope of the valley, where limestone is exposed and few people go. That made Renfield sit up. If Emily had been pulled into the woods from the road edge, why didn't the soil on her hair tie match most of Ridge Hollow and instead match an area almost a mile away as the crow flies? That area hadn't been thoroughly grid searched in 2006 because it was hard to reach, thick brush, large boulders, and especially because it wasn't on Emily's normal running route. This opened a chilling possibility. Emily may have been taken much farther than the spot where the hair tie was found, in the opposite direction from the original search theory. But Renfield didn't want to rely on instinct. He needed science to reconstruct movement. He contacted the State Behavioral Geography Analysis Center, which uses modern terrain data and simulates optimal paths based on slope, vegetation density, grade, and the limitations of a person being forced or carried. The team entered all known data: Emily's running route, hair tie location, witness noise locations, direction of the gray truck, forest zones, and creek beds. After hours of processing, the digital map returned a striking conclusion. If the perpetrator wanted to remove Emily from Ridge Hollow fastest without being seen, the most logical route was north, into secluded forest pockets with no trails. Exactly the areas not searched in 2006. Renfield stared at the map, where the simulated offender path glowed red, running straight through the zone, whose soil matched the hair tie particles. He circled that zone, feeling the first real movement in a case that had been ice cold on the Cumberland Plateau for 13 years. For the first time, they had a direction, specific, scientifically supported, not guesswork. But Renfield didn't stop there. He added wind, weather, and sunlight data from the morning Emily vanished to test witness sound reports. The acoustic propagation map showed that sound from the northern zone would have carried down to Ridge Hollow given the wind direction that morning, matching the 2006 witness statement perfectly. Another piece clicked. Finally, he asked the system to reconstruct the entire timeline from the minute Emily left home until Buddy ran back. Emily's average pace, time to the curve where the witness last saw her, window for an offender arriving by vehicle, and likelihood of a struggle in the woods. The simulation revealed the offender could have been trailing Emily only minutes before witness Bradley saw the gray truck, meaning the perpetrator wasn't there by chance. He had stalked, chosen the moment, prepared. Old details suddenly came alive, as if the crime were happening in front of him. Male DNA, soil from a specific northern zone, wind carrying sound down the hollow, algorithm mapped optimal escape route. And when Renfield looked again at the 2006 suspect list, he knew only one person still lived directly below that northern zone, right where the simulation marked the final convergence point. Dale Rusk. His name stood out like red ink on white paper. And this time, Renfield had far more than contradictory statements to go knock on his door again. The scattered fragments from 2006 were finally starting to touch one another, and the center of the picture, though still unclear, was slowly emerging from the dark. While Detective Renfield was focused on the new forensic analysis and the northern Ridge Hollow terrain direction, an unexpected event occurred that even he hadn't anticipated. Two women showed up at the Harlan County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with the investigator handling the Emily Carver case. They introduced themselves as Hannah Lowe and Jenna Whitaker, both former residents of Harlan County in the 2000s, and both carried a tension that told Renfield instantly they weren't here for something trivial. Hannah spoke first, her voice trembling slightly, but resolute. She said that in 2005, 1 year before Emily disappeared, she had been followed multiple times by a man driving a gray pickup truck on the road from town back to her house. When Renfield asked if she remembered the license plate, Hannah shook her head, but insisted she remembered that truck and that man's face very clearly. When Renfield showed her a few photos from the file, her finger stopped immediately on the picture of Dale Rusk. No further explanation was needed. Renfield knew this was a detail worth pausing everything for. Jenna Whitaker brought an even more chilling story. In 2007, after the Emily Carver disappearance had faded into silence, Jenna had submitted an informal report to the police, but at the time, there was no evidence, and no one was actively following the case anymore, so her note was simply filed with no follow-up action. Jenna described how, one late afternoon, while she was jogging about half a mile from the Rusk property, he blocked her path with his gray pickup and asked questions that made her skin crawl. "You always run at this time, and it's pretty deserted out here. Better watch out for bad guys." The half-joking, half-menacing tone terrified her so much that she gave up jogging for months. But what grabbed Renfield's attention wasn't just the overlap between the two stories, it was the timing. Hannah was stalked in 2005. Jenna was confronted in 2007. Everything clustered around the period of Emily's disappearance. Renfield asked why they were only coming forward now. Hannah glanced at Jenna and answered, "Because back then no one thought it was connected. But when we heard you were reopening the case, we felt we had to say something." Jenna was blunter. "I'm convinced that if I hadn't changed my running schedule, I would have vanished just like Emily." Renfield wrote down every detail, every word, every expression on their faces. He realized this wasn't just supporting testimony, this was behavioral evidence. In the 2006 file, Rusk had never been classified as a potential predator because he had no prior record, and because many reports of his behavior had never been made. But now, with two independent witnesses who didn't know each other describing the same pattern of conduct over multiple years, Rusk's behavioral profile had completely changed. Renfield began asking questions from a profiling angle: a man who stalks women in remote areas, someone who targets joggers, someone who uses his vehicle as a tool of approach, someone who actively seeks out women running alone on deserted roads. When he cross-referenced that with the data from the earlier mapping analysis, the optimal route, the Northern Valley area, the secluded terrain, Renfield saw a terrifying match. Rusk lived right next to the zone that matched the soil on Emily's hair tie, exactly the direction the simulation had suggested. The scattered clues from 2006, which back then weren't enough to build a suspect profile, were now linked together by the two new statements, forming the picture of a predator operating within a fixed geographic area who repeated the same approach pattern toward women for years in a row. Renfield pressed for more about Rusk's personality from whatever interactions they remembered. Hannah said he was unnaturally quiet, stared more than he talked. Jenna described his eyes as cold and calculating, like he was sizing up whether I was worth following. That made Renfield think of a calculated offender, someone who picks vulnerable victims, learns their routines and strikes when they're most isolated. When Hannah added that Rusk had driven past her house repeatedly, for months, even though he had no reason to be in her neighborhood, Renfield noted long-term target stalking. When Jenna described how Rusk blocked her path by stopping suddenly, turning around, then creeping behind her for a few dozen yards before peeling off, Renfield added testing the victim's reaction. Every detail they provided fit the pattern of opportunistic predators, men who don't necessarily act every time they make contact, but are always waiting for the right moment to strike. More importantly, their statements opened an investigative avenue the 2006 team never had. Rusk had a history of dangerous behavior, both before and after Emily's disappearance, but it had never been fully reported. Both women clearly remembered his gray truck, same year, same color, same dent on the left side of the bed. And one detail Renfield zeroed in on: both Hannah and Jenna had been approached by Rusk while jogging alone, just like Emily. Renfield sat quietly for a moment, looking at the two anxious women in front of him. He realized it wasn't DNA technology or terrain mapping that had created this breakthrough. It was two women who had once carried the same fear, finding each other and deciding not to stay silent anymore. They had become the missing pieces the case needed to start moving again, and with their testimony, Renfield understood that the 2006 investigation had missed a core element. Rusk's behavior wasn't random, it was a repeated pattern over time. When they left the station, Renfield stood up, walked to the whiteboard in the room, and circled three names in red: Hannah, Jenna, Rusk. Those three names connected like a perfect triangle, and he knew this turning point would finally take the investigation somewhere it hadn't reached in 13 years. The appearance of Hannah and Jenna made Detective Renfield realize that to go further, he had to map out Dale Rusk's entire behavioral past, not just what was in the official files, but everything the people of Harlan County knew, yet had never spoken aloud. He started with Rusk's ex-wife, Marla Rusk, who had left Kentucky nearly 10 years earlier after a quiet but chaotic divorce. When Renfield reached her, Marla initially refused to talk, but after being told the investigation concerned Emily Carver's disappearance, she went silent for a long time and then agreed to answer. Over the phone, her voice was hoarse, laced with caution. Marla said that throughout their marriage, Rusk had always been controlling, irrationally jealous, and constantly followed her wherever she went. She said he used to tail her in his truck from the grocery store all the way home, sometimes parking at the end of the street just to watch. When Renfield asked if Rusk had ever shown a particular interest in women who jogged or walked alone, Marla sighed and said she had caught him multiple times staring at young women running past their yard. Once she asked why he just stood there watching, and he answered coldly, "Want to know where they're going, see if they know the way back." That comment had chilled her at the time, but it wasn't enough to report him. When asked about 2006, the year Emily vanished, Marla went quiet for a very long time before saying, "That was when I started realizing he was capable of things a normal person wouldn't do." She said that right after the news about Emily broke, Rusk came home unusually tense, said nothing, washed the truck for an oddly long time, then laundered every piece of clothing he'd worn that day, even though there had been no rain or noticeable mud. When she asked about it, he snapped at her and told her to stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. That made Renfield flag the entire interview in red. This was the first confirmation anyone had given that Rusk altered his behavior exactly at the time Emily disappeared. From there, Renfield tracked down Rusk's younger brother, Tommy Rusk, who still lived in a town about 30 miles away. Tommy seemed uncomfortable talking about his brother. He described Rusk as standoffish, quiet, and always convinced everyone was against him. But what caught Renfield's attention most was that Tommy clearly remembered Rusk's driving habits. He liked cruising around early in the morning, especially on roads with hardly any traffic. When Renfield asked specifically about Ridge Hollow, Tommy nodded immediately. He took that road so often my buddies thought he was out looking for firewood. But I know he never chopped wood a day in his life. Tommy also admitted Rusk had a weird thing with younger women, not direct approaches but watching them, sometimes following them in his gray truck without saying a word. Tommy said he had once warned his brother, Dale, doing that makes people think you're some kind of creep, but Rusk just smirked. Renfield saw every statement pushing Rusk deeper into the center of suspicion. Not because of one isolated incident, but because of a years-long behavioral pattern. To complete the picture, Renfield spoke with former co-workers from the small garage where Rusk used to work. A middle-aged man named Briggs remembered that Rusk always showed up late, left early, and barely spoke to anyone. But one thing Briggs recalled clearly, whenever a young woman came in for an oil change or repairs, he got different, quieter, but his eyes never left them. One time I caught him following a female customer all the way out to the parking lot, standing a few steps behind her without saying anything. She turned around, saw him, panicked, jumped in her car, and sped off. When I asked what the hell he was doing, he just said he was checking the plate. Little stories like that hadn't seemed important in 2006, but in the context of the 2019 reinvestigation, they were heavy stones tipping the scale of suspicion. Renfield dug back into Old Town reports and discovered something surprising. There had been at least 3 calls reporting harassment or stalking to local police between 2004 and 2007, but all were logged as vague with insufficient information to act on. None of the calls mentioned Rusk by name, but the vehicle description, gray dented bed, matched perfectly. When Renfield plotted the locations of the calls, a clear pattern emerged, all within a 3-mile radius of Rusk's house, and 2 of them along the Ridge Hollow jogging route. In the information-scarce, technology-limited environment of 2006, those scattered reports had never been connected. But now, placed alongside Hannah's and Jenna's statements, Marla's and Tommy's accounts, and the workplace behavior multiple colleagues had witnessed, the picture became far more sinister. Rusk wasn't just an oddball, he had a long history of predatory stalking, approaching and control. Renfield realized the Emily Carver case no longer stood alone. It was part of a chain of behavior in which Emily was the one who disappeared, while the other potential victims had luckily gotten away. As he reviewed everything he had just gathered, one detail stood out above the rest. Almost every statement mentioned Ridge Hollow, the jogging trail where Emily vanished. And years later, people still saw Rusk driving that road habitually, even though he had no reason to go into those woods. The memories of Harlan County residents, once ignored, now pointed like arrows straight at Dale Rusk. Renfield wrote in the file, Rusk has a multi-year history of stalking women. Ridge Hollow is an area he frequented regularly. Need to expand investigation into his entire past activity. And in that moment, Renfield understood that Rusk's past was no longer a collection of random anecdotes, it was a behavioral map leading directly into the darkness where Emily Carver had vanished. Once Dale Rusk's complete past behavioral profile had been sketched out, Detective Renfield knew the next step could no longer rely on statements or theoretical analysis. They needed to watch Rusk in the present, in his daily life, in the habits he couldn't hide. So in early summer 2019, a covert surveillance operation was launched, with the team split into 3 rotating groups, following Rusk from early morning until late at night, without raising his suspicion. Rusk lived alone in an old wooden house on the edge of the valley, a sparsely traveled area, with only one main access road, perfect for long-range cameras and vehicle tracking. On the first day of surveillance, Renfield and his team noted that Rusk still drove the same old gray pickup, same rattling engine, and same dent in the bed as described in 2006. Legally it meant nothing, but it cemented the pieces they had already collected. He never fixed the truck, never replaced it, and had no intention of erasing traces. In the following days, Rusk displayed fairly monotonous routines: early morning on the porch, smoking drive to a small garage for part-time work, quick lunch at home, afternoons sometimes spent standing in the yard, staring toward Ridge Hollow, as if watching or waiting for something. But what caught Renfield's attention most was Rusk's garbage routine. Every single Wednesday evening, he carried the trash bag out to the road at the exact same time, almost ritualistically. Each time he walked straight from the porch steps to the curb, no lingering, no excessive looking around. Yet Renfield noticed something odd. Rusk's trash bags were always tied tightly, nothing visible inside, and he always lifted the bag with only his right hand, as if minimizing skin contact. That immediately made Renfield think Rusk was deliberately trying not to leave DNA on the bag's surface, a level of caution the average person would never consider. When the surveillance team watched more closely, they discovered another suspicious habit. Rusk always waited until the garbage truck was out of sight before coming back out to check the curb again, as if making sure no one had taken his bag before collection. To Renfield, this was no longer random behavior. It was a sign Rusk was paranoid about being watched, or at the very least aware that DNA on his trash could be used against him. That made obtaining an indirect sample both more urgent and more complicated. The team had to find a weakness in his routine. They planned undercover officers disguised as morning walkers or dog walkers near the route at the exact time Rusk took out the trash. But no matter how often they rotated personnel, Rusk remained highly alert, scanning the area before setting the bag down. In the third week, a small change appeared. Rusk was coughing constantly, apparently fighting a cold, and when he stepped out with the trash, he tossed a used tissue into the bag right before tying it. The motion was quick, but the surveillance camera caught it clearly. Renfield immediately noted, tissue, highest probability DNA source. The problem was retrieving the bag without Rusk noticing, or the garbage truck taking it first. So the team devised a plan. An officer in an unmarked pickup disguised as a plumbing service truck waited a few dozen yards away. The moment Rusk went back inside after setting the bag down, two undercover investigators walked briskly over, grabbed the real bag, tossed it into a fake bin on their truck, and placed an identical decoy bag in the exact spot. The whole swap took under 8 seconds. When Rusk came back out 5 minutes later to check, he saw the bag still sitting there and went back inside without suspicion. In the truck, Renfield personally opened the seized bag, wearing nitrile gloves, used tweezers to remove the crumpled tissue, and sealed it in an evidence envelope. The smell of cigarettes and engine oil wafted out, but that didn't matter. What they needed was in the few skin cells, mucus or saliva, accidentally left on that thin piece of paper. He sealed the envelope, signed the chain of custody label with time and location. In that moment, Renfield felt clearly that the investigation had entered a completely new phase, no longer based on guesses, statements, or simulated maps, but on biological evidence. Surveillance of Rusk continued, however. The team kept logging his habits, still driving Ridge Hollow in the mornings for no apparent reason, still avoiding almost all interaction with townspeople, still standing at dusk, staring into the northern valley darkness, as if remembering something that happened there. Everything was meticulously documented, because Renfield knew that whether the DNA matched or not, the behavioral pattern of a predator would be a powerful piece of the case file. As night fell over Harlan County and the trash bag containing the evidence was rushed by courier to the state lab, Renfield sat in the surveillance vehicle staring at the faint porch light of Rusk's house. He understood that every passing hour could be the key to cracking a case that had been frozen for over 13 years. And if the DNA on that tissue matched the sample recovered from Emily's hair tie, it would be the first moment in more than a decade that the darkness over Ridge Hollow began to crack, letting in a sliver of truth. However, the first garbage bag seized only yielded a few faint DNA traces, too degraded to build a complete profile. The lab quickly reported back. They needed clearer samples, ideally from metal or plastic items Rusk had touched most recently. For that reason, Detective Renfield continued to direct the covert surveillance team to shadow him in all his daily activities, especially at the Pine Creek lumberyard, where Rusk worked part-time and habitually drank soda and coffee during breaks. The surveillance team set up long-range cameras covering 2 angles of the yard's parking area. Within just 3 days, they documented a clear pattern. Every morning, Rusk bought a bottle of illuminating, the famous Kentucky soda, from the vending machine near the yard entrance, drank it dry, and tossed the can into the trash bin behind the warehouse without tying the bag or tearing off the label. In the afternoons, he usually carried a paper coffee cup from the office, finished it, and threw it straight into the outdoor trash before clocking out. Those 2 items, the aluminum soda can and the paper coffee cup, were ideal surfaces for collecting touch DNA, far cleaner than the tissues from his household garbage. A plan was put into motion at the end of Rusk's shift. When he left through the side door and the temporary parking lot was empty, 2 undercover investigators, dressed as workers, quietly approached the trash bin behind the warehouse. Beneath crumpled plastic bags and scattered wood shavings, they located the illuminating can that cameras had confirmed Rusk was holding just 30 minutes earlier. The can still showed faint lip prints, the aluminum rim glinted under their flashlight. Next to it was the paper coffee cup, its plastic lid still bearing lip oil and residual warmth. Both items were immediately placed into specialized evidence bags, sealed, and rushed that same night to the state lab. Renfield said nothing when he signed the submission receipt, but his face could not hide a cautious hope. For 13 years, the case had been stalled for lack of biological evidence. Now, just a few skin cells, a few lingering epithelial cells on the can rim or cup lid, could change everything. 3 weeks later, the official results came back. Renfield opened the envelope in the small precinct conference room, cold white fluorescent light falling on the page, while the investigative team stood silently around the table, no one daring to breathe heavily. The report stated, touch DNA from the rim of the illuminating can matched the male DNA profile recovered from Emily Carver's hair tie in 2006. That single line froze the entire room. A young officer whispered, "A match, that means," Renfield gave a slight nod, eyes never leaving the report. "It means the man who touched the hair tie in 2006 is the same man who drank from this soda can last week." But the report did not stop there. The next section showed that the coffee cup recovered the following day also contained very clear touch DNA, sufficient to generate a genetic profile with more STR loci than the sample from the hair tie. When the 2 profiles were overlaid, the match held firm, and the lab concluded the probability of a random match was virtually 0. A major turning point, the most significant breakthrough in the investigation since 2006, was formed right there. For years, everything had rested on suspicion, conjecture, conflicting statements, and scattered warnings from women Rusk had stalked. But now it was no longer words, no longer memory. It was DNA, biological evidence that cannot lie, cannot fade with time, cannot be hidden by denial. The heavy silence in the conference room turned into intense focus. Renfield read every line of the report, then placed his hand on the table and spoke slowly but firmly. The DNA on the hair tie is linked to Rusk in 2006. The DNA on the illuminating can is linked to Rusk in 2019. 2 time periods, 2 independent items of evidence, same person. The team understood this was not coincidence. It meant Emily's hair tie had not simply fallen at the forest edge. It may have been yanked, pulled, thrown, or dropped during a struggle. And the hand that touched it was the same hand Rusk still used every day to open soda cans at the lumberyard. From nothing, the case now had a direct, tangible, scientific connection between past and present. Renfield looked up at the whiteboard where Rusk's name had been circled in red for weeks, now underlined with 3 heavy dots. An officer asked, "What do we do next?" Renfield replied, voice low but certain, "This is no longer suspicion. This is DNA-based inference. This is the pivot point of the investigation." He gathered the files, stood, and added, "We don't just know someone was with Emily when she vanished. We know who that person is." The illuminating can was placed back into evidence, but this time it carried the weight of truth, a truth no one had grasped for 13 years. And from that moment, the Emily Carver investigation would never be the same again. When the DNA from the Alate 1 can and coffee cup matched perfectly with the touch DNA recovered from Emily's hair tie, Detective Renfield knew it was time to connect all the scattered pieces of the past 13 years into a complete picture. He spread the full Ridge Hollow topographic map across the table, marking in red the last place a witness saw Emily, the location where the hair tie was found, the wind direction that morning, and the time of sunrise. He then overlaid the geospatial team's terrain simulation and optimal path analysis based on soil microparticle evidence. With every point in place, Renfield began reconstructing the entire probable sequence of events in chronological order, leaving out no detail. He started with witness Bradley, who saw Emily jogging past the Ridge Hollow bend at a steady pace with no sign of distress. Bradley described a gray pickup truck moving slowly behind her, engine rattling, bed dented, details that matched Rusk's truck exactly. Based on Emily's average running speed and the time Bradley lost sight of her, Renfield calculated the perpetrator made contact within 1 to 2 minutes after she disappeared from the witness's view. That was a critically narrow window, fast, precise, and requiring the perpetrator to have been stalking Emily beforehand. Using a terrain ruler, Renfield measured the distance from Bradley's vantage point to the deeper bend where the trail narrowed and visibility was blocked. From that spot to where the hair tie was recovered was just over 200 meters, a distance perfectly consistent with a rapid surprise abduction. The hair tie lay at the forest edge on disturbed soil, and the soil microparticles recovered from it matched the composition of the North Valley slope, proof Emily had been dragged or pushed in that direction. With this data, Renfield concluded the initial takeover occurred immediately after the Ridge Hollow bend, where dense oak created natural shadow even in morning light. There, the perpetrator could stop his truck for seconds without being seen. Even the rattling engine of the pickup could blend with the dry creek and mountain wind. Emily was fast and strong. A direct attack while she was running was unlikely. Instead, Renfield reasoned the perpetrator probably used a command or weapon threat to force her to stop. That explained the lack of major struggle signs at the first sight. The initial control required no brute force. But when Renfield examined the hair tie location more than 200 meters away, he understood the real struggle happened there. The tie was torn or fell off, soil was disturbed, and the eerie quiet of that morning was swallowed by the forest. From that point, Renfield rotated the map and followed the optimal route the terrain simulation identified for moving Emily unseen. The route led straight to the north slope, an area full of limestone, thick brush, hollows, and no trails. It was the direction the 2006 search teams had not prioritized because of the extreme terrain. Renfield used the ruler to calculate the maximum distance an adult male controlling a victim could cover in thick, steep forest within 5-7 minutes, the exact area whose soil mineral composition matched the sample on the hair tie. This was no coincidence. It was a geological marker. When combined with witness statements of strange rustling sounds from north of Ridge Hollow, the morning Emily vanished, possibly footsteps or struggle, the picture became clearer. Wind that day blew north to south, easily carrying sound from the secondary struggle site back toward the road. Renfield cross-referenced Rusk's property location. His house sat directly below the north slope, little more than a mile away through the woods. Close enough for the perpetrator to reach via shortcut, far enough that 2006 searchers heard or saw nothing on the first day. Everything, DNA, terrain, witness statements, timing, location, converged on the same direction. Renfield stared at the map for a long time, as if trying to replay every second of that morning. Emily, rounding the bend, Rusk's gray truck following, he waits for the witness to lose sight. Stops the truck, approaches, gains control silently, drags the victim into the woods. The second struggle at the hair tie site, then carries Emily deeper onto the north slope, where red clay lime soil clung to evidence, and vanishes before searchers arrived. Putting the entire timeline together sent a chill down Renfield's spine, not from shock, but because after 13 years, the case had finally escaped the fog of its earliest days. Reconstructing the sequence was not just progress, It was the foundation for turning suspicion into legal conclusion, and Renfield knew that from here, they were no longer groping in the dark. They were following the perpetrator's footprints. Late afternoon, on an early fall day in 2019, as the Kentucky sky turned ashen orange and the long shadows of the Appalachian Range stretched over the town, Detective Renfield and a federal arrest team quietly closed in on the Harlan Walmart parking lot, where Dale Rusk still shopped every weekend. They chose the location not only because of his fixed routine, but because the large open area was easy to control and minimized risk to civilians if Rusk reacted unpredictably. Surveillance cameras captured the moment he walked out of the store, carrying a small plastic bag with screws and odds and ends. As he opened the door of his dusty gray pickup, Renfield gave the signal. 4 plainclothes officers approached from 2 directions, fast, clean, decisive. One blocked the steering wheel to prevent reversal. Another stood at the passenger door, and Renfield walked straight up, drew the arrest warrant, and spoke calmly, but leaving no room for evasion. "Dale Rusk, you are under arrest in connection with the disappearance of Emily Carver by order of Harlan County Court." Rusk froze, his face briefly draining of color, but he offered no resistance. He only muttered one calculated line, "I didn't do anything." That statement once again carried no weight against the DNA results. He was handcuffed, read his Miranda rights, and placed in a separate vehicle amid the ordinary noise of a busy Walmart parking lot where no one noticed the quiet arrest. The moment Rusk was taken away, the search team stood ready to execute the warrant at his house, an old wooden home at the foot of the north slope of Ridge Hollow. The house had changed little since 2006 descriptions: warped wooden porch, faded front door, front yard littered with rocks and weeds. The forensics team entered each area in strict sequence: living room, kitchen, bedroom, backyard, shed, and especially the vehicle undercarriage. Every item was photographed, labeled, and bagged. In the bedroom, they found Rusk's old clothes, many so worn they had lost their shape. Those garments were collected for possible soil particles or residual skin cells. In the living room, they discovered old hunting magazines, rope, flashlights, and various outdoor items that were not illegal but notable given his behavior pattern. Each was logged for comparison with his known profile. In the backyard shed, the team noted old soil disturbances, but nothing recent enough to prove anything. They dug several suspect spots at Renfield's direction, but beneath the surface lay only limestone, roots, and ancient red clay. No body, no clothing belonging to Emily, no hidden personal items. That was not unexpected. Renfield had anticipated Rusk would not keep a body close to home, but when they examined the toolbox in the shed, they found items that made the whole team pause: a rusted hunting knife, an old jacket with a torn shoulder, and a plastic bin that smelled of mildew. All were seized, not because they directly tied to Emily, but because they showed Rusk spent far more time in the woods than he had ever admitted. In particular, the team jacked up his pickup on temporary lifts and thoroughly examined the undercarriage. The caked dirt contained multiple sediment layers, including dried, crumbling red clay-lime soil, strikingly similar to the sample analyzed from Emily's hair tie. Though not yet standalone legal evidence, it aligned disturbingly with the terrain model Renfield had built. When the forensics team moved to probe the softer soil along the side of the house with long rods, searching for air pockets underground, they found no voids consistent with burial. A younger officer sounded disappointed. "Without a body, he can still deny everything." Renfield stood nearby, eyes fixed on the damp reddish-brown earth. "The body isn't here," he said slowly. "Not where he could be watched. He's smarter than that." Although no remains were located on the property, Renfield ordered the seizure of numerous potential exhibits for analysis: soil samples from the undercarriage, old clothing, the hunting knife, old rubber boots, and rope from the shed. The search lasted over 4 hours, and when the forensics team sealed the final evidence crate, dusk had fallen, leaving only the weak yellow light from the isolated house in the valley. Renfield stood on the porch steps, surveyed the land, then looked up at the northern mountains. He knew that although today's arrest was a huge step forward, the most important question, "Where is Emily?" remained unanswered. No body, no direct trace, only DNA, witness statements, behavioral profiling, and a terrain map pointing in one direction. The investigation was not over, but for the first time in 13 years, the darkness around Ridge Hollow had been pierced, and Renfield knew that now, with Dale Rusk in custody, the truth would no longer stand still. Rusk was brought into the interview room that same night. His handcuffs were removed, but two officers stood guard on either side like tense shadows. The harsh white light illuminated his habitually blank, closed-off face, yet this time something else flickered in his eyes, a tiny twitch at the corner, the unmistakable sign of fear he was trying but failing to hide. Detective Renfield did not sit immediately. He placed an evidence bag on the metal table and let it rest there for several seconds, unopened, unexplained. Rusk glanced at the bag, then at Renfield, then tried to look away. But his eyes kept returning to it, as if the bag itself were pulling him under. Renfield opened it. Inside was the aluminum Ale-81 can, the soda can the surveillance team had collected at the lumberyard. Renfield turned it slowly under the light, just enough to reveal the metallic rim and the faint marks where lips had touched. "Recognize this?" Renfield asked, voice even, neither threatening nor gentle, just the naked approach of a truth closing in. Rusk swallowed hard. "Just a soda can. I drink soda every day." "So what?" Renfield did not answer. He pulled out the DNA report, laid it on the table, and turned it so Rusk could clearly read the bold line, "Touch DNA match with the male DNA profile from Emily Carver's hair tie." At first, Rusk only stared, as if he did not comprehend. Then his eyes widened. A rapid collapse began behind his pupils. Renfield sat down across from him, hands clasped. "We have your DNA on Emily's hair tie. We have your DNA on this can. 2 different times, 2 separate items of evidence. Same person." Rusk leaned back in the chair, his breathing growing shallow. He looked around the room, searching for an escape from the 4 indifferent walls tightening around him. "No, that's impossible. I never touched her." His voice shook so badly the sentence broke in half. Renfield leaned forward. "You didn't just touch her. You took her into the woods. You know that." Rusk clenched his fists until the knuckles went white. I didn't mean." That breathless fragment told Renfield the man had reached his limit. He pulled another item from the bag, the terrain map marked with DNA points, witness sightings, wind direction, hair tie location, and placed it in the center of the table. "Dale, we know exactly where you took control of Emily. We know which direction you dragged her. We know you're more familiar with the northern trails than anyone. We know you stalked women for years. And we know you were not at Ridge Hollow that morning by accident." Rusk squeezed his eyes shut, his whole body shrinking. Tiny beads of sweat slid down his temples. "You don't understand. I didn't plan, but you did it," Renfield cut in. Voice not loud but sharp enough to strike the opening Rusk had just revealed. A long silence stretched the air taut. Rusk opened his eyes, dull, red, exhausted. But more importantly, he abandoned all resistance. She ran past," he whispered. "I just wanted to talk, but she got scared. She ran faster. Then he pressed his hands to his forehead, voice choking. "I didn't mean to. I lost control." Renfield said nothing, letting him slide deeper into his own truth. "She fell," she screamed. "I panicked. I dragged her into the woods because I didn't want anyone to hear." He began to cry, not loudly, but with a raw, guttural pain that barely sounded human. Renfield let him speak, never interrupting. "I didn't know what to do. I just wanted it to stop. But she fought so hard. Then she stopped moving." Rusk dropped his head, hands trembling violently. An officer behind him tightened his grip on his duty belt, but Renfield raised a hand slightly. "Stand down." The case was opening right in front of them, piece by piece. "Dale," Renfield said slowly. "Where is Emily?" Rusk did not answer at first. He stared at the table, then the wall, then back at Renfield, as if the truth were a door he had locked years ago. Finally he spoke, voice hoarse and broken. "I carried her away. I didn't bury her near the house. I knew they'd search. I took a long way around, past the limestone, down near Martin's Fork Lake." Renfield sat up straighter. That was a vast area full of ravines, rock pockets, and tangled roots, perfect for disposal. Exactly where? Rusk pressed his hands together, as if reliving every step he took that long night in 2006. "There's a shallow ravine, not far from the lake," he whispered. "Big white rocks. I pushed her down there." A chill ran through the room. Renfield leaned forward another inch. "You have to show us the exact spot," he said. "We need to know where Emily is." Rusk nodded, tears falling onto the metal table. With a shaking hand he reached out, touched the map, slowly but surely, and pointed to a spot deep in the forest, where limestone ravines converged like a natural web. "Here," he said. "I left her here." In that moment the interview room fell deathly silent. No more evasive suspect. No more liar. Only a man finally crushed by the truth. And for the first time in 13 years, the name Emily Carver was spoken, not in desperation, but in a confession that opened the door to where she had lain all that time. The investigation team immediately deployed to the shallow ravine north of Martin's Fork Lake at first light the next morning, carrying the map Rusk had marked, GPS equipment, and a full forensic team equipped for excavation in limestone terrain. As they crossed the white boulders the size of dining tables, the beams from their handheld lights hit the damp moss around the ravine's mouth, creating a heavy atmosphere that seemed to preserve intact a secret more than 13 years old. They stopped exactly at the spot Rusk had tremblingly pointed out the night before, a crevice no deeper than 3 meters, but wide enough to hide everything from passers-by. The forensic technicians secured safety ropes and lowered themselves one by one, using soft brushes and soil probes to search for anything unusual. Just minutes later, a quiet but certain call rose from the bottom. "We have bones." The whole group fell silent for several seconds before a flashlight. Beams illuminated scattered human bone fragments covered in the distinctive red soil of Harlan County. They continued excavating meticulously, centimeter by centimeter, avoiding any disturbance of the original positioning, and gradually collected everything that remained of Emily Carver after 13 years: arm bones, leg bones, pelvis, several broken ribs, an intact skull with a longitudinal crack on the left side, along with some personal items the family had described on the day she vanished. An Asics running shoe in white and gray with a rotted sole, shoelaces still tangled with orange clay, and most crucially, the metal braces still attached to the jaw, which became the fastest means of identification, quicker than any test. The forensic team placed everything into specialized containers and drafted the scene report right there at the crevice, simultaneously photographing the entire location, elevation, wind direction, and soil subsidence to ensure every piece of information could be used as evidence in court. When the message "Emily Carver has been found" came over the radio, in the interrogation room, where Rusk was still being held in isolation, he sat motionless, as if he already knew that from this moment, his life had entered a phase with no way back. Renfield looked at him for a few seconds before saying, "We found her, exactly where you said." At that, Rusk lowered his head and offered no further resistance. His mind seemed empty, knowing that his entire statement was no longer a tactic or negotiation, but the final confirmation of an undeniable truth. In the examination lab, the collected evidence was analyzed non-stop for 3 days. DNA in the bone marrow was degraded, but sufficient to match the 2006 missing person profile. The braces matched Emily's dental records. Remaining fabric scraps were from the type of athletic top the family had described, and most importantly, the soil stuck to the shoe perfectly matched the Ridge Hollow location, more than 3 miles from where the body was found, proving she had been moved after being subdued. Based on Rusk's confession and the crime scene analysis, investigators fully reconstructed the events of the night Emily disappeared. Rusk followed her in his gray pickup, watching her on the Ridge Hollow curve. When she slowed on the downhill section, Rusk stopped, got out, and approached from behind. Emily instinctively tried to run back up the road, but he grabbed her arm and dragged her to the edge of the woods, causing her hair tie to fall. The first piece of evidence recovered in 2006, she fought back, leaving scratches on his arms that matched his later statement. Rusk shoved her hard, causing her to fall onto the rocks and sustain a head injury. After several minutes of uncontrolled panic, he dragged her into the truck, drove along a logging trail only locals knew, took her to the Martins Fork Lake area, chose a shallow crevice, pushed the body in, and covered it with large rocks to prevent animals from moving it. When he left, he took every identifiable item but missed the left shoe, which was found with the remains. These details became the backbone of the entire indictment. When the case file was transferred to the Harlan County Prosecutor's Office, Prosecutor Leslie Granger read every page of evidence through the night, highlighting key points: inculpatory DNA, confession matching the scene, 2006 mourning witnesses, reconstructed travel route, soil evidence, and trash items, all containing Rusk's DNA. A81 cans, coffee cups. She built the charges around 3 counts: first-degree kidnapping, murder in the commission of a felony, and tampering with a corpse. The most critical part was proving that the kidnapping leading to death was intentional, albeit indirect, and controllable, allowing prosecution at the highest level under Kentucky law in 2006. In court, Granger laid out every step Rusk took, using Ridge Hollow maps, wind diagrams, and 3D forensic renderings to describe the moment Emily was blocked. She called 2006 witnesses to confirm they saw a gray pickup driving slowly and heard strange noises in the woods. She displayed photos of physical evidence, DNA reports, soil analysis, and location-matching data to prove Emily's body had been moved from the running site to the disposal site. Every piece of evidence was admitted because the chain of custody had been perfectly preserved from the 2006 cold storage to the new 2019 examination. Rusk sat silently inside the dock, hands clasped, no longer trying to appear defiant as he had in the early days after arrest. He simply kept his head down as the indictment was read, each sentence landing like stones, and whenever the prosecutor mentioned how he had shoved Emily into the shallow crevice and left her there forever, several people in the courtroom gripped their seats, choked with emotion. When Granger concluded her closing argument, she looked straight at the jury and said, "It took us 13 years to find Emily. But justice never forgets. All the evidence, scientific, eyewitness, topographical, confessional, had connected into a complete picture, paving the way for the ultimate verdict the court was about to deliver." On the morning of sentencing, the Harlan County courtroom was packed in a silent, oppressive way, not from noise but from the weight of 13 years of waiting, of questions once thought forever unanswered. When defendant Dale Rusk was brought in, the clank of his handcuffs produced a small metallic sound that was enough to make the entire room tense. In the front row of seats, the Carver family bowed their heads, hands tightly clasped, as if a single misplaced movement could shatter the fragile calm they had struggled to maintain since Emily's remains were found. Judge Caldwell stepped up to the bench, placed a thick case file in front of him, containing the results of an investigation that spanned 2006 to 2019, irrefutable scientific proof, witness statements, Ridge Hollow maps, soil analysis photos, and Rusk's final confession in the interrogation room, everything tying together into an undeniable truth. When everyone in the room had settled, the judge read slowly and clearly, word by word, on the charge of kidnapping resulting in death, the court sentences defendant Dale Rusk to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Those words rang out like a hammer striking the air. Some people flinched, some quietly began to cry, and the Carver family simply froze, as if their breath had been sucked away for several seconds. The judge continued in the same cold, steady tone. On the charge of tampering with physical evidence, the court sentences the defendant to 20 years imprisonment. He turned another page. On the charge of abuse of a corpse, the court sentences the defendant to 10 years imprisonment. Then he closed the file, looked directly at Rusk, and delivered the final sentencing line. The sentences shall run consecutively, resulting in a final punishment of life imprisonment, without possibility of parole. The defendant will spend the remainder of his life in a Kentucky state prison. Dale Rusk stood motionless. No reaction, no argument, no attempt to appear strong as he had in earlier hearings. The defiance was long gone, replaced by an emptiness like an abandoned house after a storm. 2 deputies escorted him past the public seating, and as he passed the row where the Carver family sat, Emily's mother quietly turned her face away. Tears rolled down but without sobs, as if she had already cried everything out years ago, leaving only pain that had soaked into every breath. When the courtroom doors closed behind Rusk, everyone in the room seemed to exhale at once, a long, heavy breath that carried a hint of release, after years suspended between hope and despair. News of the sentence spread quickly throughout Harlan County, passing through every small downtown shop, every roadside diner, every scattered home in the Appalachian Valley. Many who had lived there since 2006 said they still clearly remembered the morning Emily vanished. The sound of police sirens on Ridge Hollow, the search teams sweeping the woods with flashlights, and the fear that crept onto every porch when they learned a young woman had disappeared right in their tight-knit community, that usually left doors unlocked and believed nothing truly terrible could happen here. And when they heard the case was finally resolved, the community's feeling was not just relief, but a mixture of shock and stunned realization, because the perpetrator was not a stranger, but someone who had lived nearby, shopped at the same stores, driven the same roads they used to take their kids to school every day. The old fear returned, no longer a vague nightmare, but a real lesson that evil can lurk in the shadow right next door for years without anyone knowing. Local media and cold case volunteer groups across Kentucky quickly analyzed the case, calling it a textbook example of the power of next-generation forensic technology, the persistence of investigators who re-examined old files, and most importantly, the role of the women Rusk had previously stalked, Hannah Lowe and Jenna Whitaker, who created the turning point by finally coming forward in 2019. Many experts called them the light in a dark file, because without their statements, the weight of the DNA evidence might have taken many more years to surface. Community safety forums began to be held in Harlan County, with Detective Renfield personally participating to explain how this cold case was cracked, from remapping the Ridge Hollow running route with modern topographic tools, to collecting touch DNA from discarded trash, to using microsoil analysis to prove the body had been moved. Everything turned the Emily Carver case into an important lesson for rural counties facing disappearances with no witnesses, no cameras, and limited resources like those available in 2006. For Emily's family, the moment the sentence was pronounced was not the victory they had hoped for. Because no victory could bring Emily back, but it was the final answer. The answer they had searched for in vain for over a decade, through flyer distributions, hopeful phone calls, memorial services, without a body to place flowers on. Nights when Emily's mother would bolt awake at 3 a.m., thinking she heard her daughter's footsteps in the hallway. As they left the courthouse, Emily's father quietly told the local paper, "We buried our little girl today, not in the ground, but in the truth." In the twilight over Harlan Valley that day, the sky turned purple-gray, the Appalachian ridges shrouded in pale mist like the long exhale of old earth. Many said it felt as if the land itself had finally set down the burden of keeping a secret for far too long. And in that quiet, Emily's stories, her laughter, her morning runs on the dirt roads of Ridge Hollow, her dog Buddy, who used to follow her and came home alone, were told again by the townspeople, no longer in fear, but in remembrance, the way this small community began to heal from a tragedy that had changed them forever. Emily Carver disappeared on an autumn morning in 2006, but after the final verdict, she was no longer an unsolved missing person case. She had been found, named, brought home, and in the hearts of the people who live in this valley, she became the reason they learned to look again at what had once been overlooked. To believe in the endurance of justice, and to understand that sometimes it takes 13 years to find the path to the truth. But it is a path worth walking, because in the end, the truth always finds its way back. The story of Emily Carver's disappearance and the solving of her case is not only a tragedy for one small Kentucky community, it is also a powerful reminder to American society today. Safety is never guaranteed, and justice sometimes requires time, perseverance, and the cooperation of an entire community to be fulfilled. This case contains elements from which modern Americans can draw specific lessons. First, personal vigilance is never unnecessary. Emily was simply jogging on her familiar route, Ridge Hollow, on an ordinary morning in a community where everyone believed everybody knows everybody. But that very familiarity created an illusion of safety, and Dale Rusk, a man who lived nearby, turned out to be a danger no one suspected. This clearly reflects a reality in the United States. Disappearances, or attacks most often, come from acquaintances, neighbors, or faces we see every day. The lesson is not to suspect everyone, but to learn to listen to intuition, report unusual behavior, and abandon the stereotype that the country is safer than the city. Second, the story underscores the critical role of modern forensic technology, something the U.S. is currently experiencing an explosion in. Touch DNA from Emily's hair tie, microsoil analysis, surveillance of trash like the Ale-81 cans Rusk threw away at the lumberyard. These techniques did not exist in 2006, but became the key in 2019. This demonstrates the importance of continuously investing in criminal science research and preserving evidence, even when a case seems unsolvable. Third, Emily's case proves the power of people who dare to speak up, like Hannah Lowe and Jenna Whitaker. They had been stalked by Rusk, but needed more than 10 years to find the courage to tell their stories. Their coming forward not only changed the direction of the investigation, but also revealed a truth. The minor harassment and odd behaviors society sometimes ignores can be signs of far more serious crimes. In an era when the United States is working to protect women and raise awareness about gender-based violence, the lesson is clear. Believe victims and witnesses, and communities must create environments where they feel safe to speak. And finally, Emily's story reminds us that justice may come late, but is never hopeless. Detective Renfield, after more than a decade, still reread every page of the file, reconstructed every step, applied every new technique. Thanks to that persistence, Emily's parents finally received the answer they needed to lay their daughter to rest, and Harlan County regained the truth it deserved. In today's world, where people easily become discouraged by speed and pressure, this story encourages us to keep pursuing what is right, no matter how difficult or lengthy, because sometimes the things we think are lost forever can still be found if we do not give up. Thank you for joining me on the journey of the Emily Carver case. If you found it meaningful, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case-solving journeys. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring files that seemed long forgotten, but still deserve justice.